Most people think control happens through persuasion. A calm voice, a convincing argument, a reasonable request. But real control rarely looks that polite. Sometimes control comes wrapped in pressure, sometimes in fear, sometimes in a quiet realization that the person in front of you has slowly removed every option except obedience. Welcome to DarkMind Academy. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most powerful and dangerous tools in the dark psychology arsenal. Coercion, not persuasion, not influence, not negotiation. Coercion is the art of forcing compliance by making resistance more painful than surrender. And once you understand how it works, you start seeing it everywhere, in relationships, workplaces, institutions, and even ordinary conversations that suddenly feel like traps. Most people believe persuasion and coercion are the same thing. After all, both attempt to change behavior. Both try to influence decisions. Both can lead someone to do something they weren't planning to do. But the difference between them is enormous. Persuasion respects choice. It presents an idea, a suggestion, a request. The other person remains free to accept or refuse. Persuasion relies on agreement. Coercion removes that freedom. Instead of convincing you to say yes, coercion slowly makes saying no feel impossible. The manipulator doesn't argue with your decision. They reshape the environment around that decision. They introduce consequences. They apply pressure. They tighten the psychological space around you until compliance starts to feel like the safest option left. And that is the real nature of coercion. It is influence through power, not agreement. To understand why coercion works so effectively, you have to understand something fundamental about human psychology. Human beings are wired to avoid pain. Not just physical pain, but emotional pain, rejection, isolation, humiliation, financial insecurity, loss of safety, loss of belonging. These fears run deep inside the human brain, and coercion exploits them perfectly. A coercive manipulator does not always shout threats or slam their fist on the table. In fact, the most effective coercion often arrives quietly. A disappointed look, a sudden withdrawal of warmth, a reminder of everything they've done for you, a subtle suggestion that things might change if you don't cooperate. The pressure builds slowly. First, it might sound harmless. If you really cared about me, you'd help me with this. After everything I've done for you, I guess I just thought you were different. None of these statements are direct threats, but they carry something far more powerful: emotional leverage. And once that leverage is established, the dynamic begins to shift. Your brain starts calculating risk. The question stops being, what do I want to do? And slowly becomes, what will happen if I refuse? That shift is where coercion begins to take hold. The manipulator understands something that most people overlook. People rarely submit because they are convinced. They submit because resisting becomes exhausting. Coercion works by increasing the cost of resistance. The first demand might seem small. A favor, compromise, a sacrifice for the relationship. But the manipulator isn't testing your generosity. They're testing your boundaries. If the first demand succeeds, the next one becomes slightly bigger. Then another, and another. Each step seems small enough to justify, small enough to rationalize, until eventually something subtle begins to happen. Your decisions stop being guided by preference. They start being guided by avoidance. Avoiding arguments, avoiding disappointment, avoiding anger, avoiding punishment. At that point, coercion no longer needs to be loud. The pressure is already doing the work. One of the most common forms of coercion appears through intimidation and threats. Sometimes those threats are obvious. A partner might say, "If you leave me, I'll make sure you regret it." A boss might hint that refusing a task could affect your promotion. The message is clear. Compliance protects you from consequences. Other times, the threats remain implied. The manipulator never states them directly. Instead, they allow you to imagine them. And the human mind is incredibly good at imagining worst-case scenarios. Emotional blackmail operates in a similar way, but instead of fear alone, it combines three powerful forces: fear, obligation, and guilt. When these emotions work together, They form a psychological fog that clouds judgment. Someone might say, "If you really loved me, you would do this," or "I'll fall apart without you." Suddenly refusing the demand feels cruel, selfish, even immoral. The target isn't just being pressured anymore, they are being made to feel responsible for the manipulator's emotional survival. Isolation is another powerful weapon in coercive control. When someone slowly distances you from friends, family, or colleagues, they are not just limiting your social life. They are removing alternative perspectives. When outside voices disappear, the manipulator becomes the dominant source of validation, criticism, and guidance. Without realizing it, the target begins depending on the very person controlling them. Control over resources can make coercion even stronger. Money, opportunities, transportation, housing, these things can all become leverage. When access to basic needs depends on another person's approval, resistance becomes far more difficult. Modern technology has also created new tools for coercion. Surveillance, monitoring messages, tracking locations, constantly checking online activity. These behaviors create an environment where privacy disappears. When someone feels watched all the time, they start censoring themselves automatically. Another subtle tactic is humiliation. Public criticism, mocking jokes, or exposing someone's vulnerabilities in front of others can create enormous social pressure. The fear of embarrassment alone can force people into compliance. Then there is exhaustion. Constant arguments, endless debates, emotional confrontations, overwhelming details. These tactics wear down resistance over time. Eventually, the target stops fighting, not because they agree, but because they are tired. The manipulator knows that exhaustion can be just as effective as fear. Sometimes coercion works through restricting choices. A manipulator might present two options, both leading to the same outcome they want. On the surface, it looks like a decision. In reality, it is a trap. You can either do this the easy way or the hard way. The illusion of choice hides the fact that the outcome was predetermined from the beginning. In more severe situations, coercion crosses into physical intimidation or unwanted advances. Personal space becomes invaded. Boundaries become ignored. The message becomes clear without needing to be spoken. Power exists and it will be used. Coercion appears in many environments. In relationships, it often becomes a pattern known as coercive control. Instead of a single demand, the manipulator slowly begins controlling daily decisions, movements, friendships, finances, and even thoughts. The person being controlled may feel like they are constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid triggering the next conflict. Workplaces can also become environments where coercion thrives. A toxic boss might isolate an employee, assign impossible tasks, withhold important information, or subtly threaten job security. Promotions, salaries, and opportunities become tools of pressure. High-control groups and cults rely heavily on coercion as well. Members are often isolated from outsiders and taught to fear the world beyond the group. Loyalty is enforced through social punishment, shame, and fear of rejection. Even sales and influence industries sometimes flirt with coercive tactics. High-pressure environments create artificial urgency, emotional manipulation, and psychological debt designed to push people into decisions they might not otherwise make. The effects of coercion on the target can be devastating. In the short term, it produces anxiety, confusion, and self-doubt. The target begins questioning their own judgment. Over time, the impact grows deeper. Self-esteem erodes. Chronic stress develops. Some people experience symptoms similar to trauma, including hypervigilance, emotional numbness, or difficulty trusting others. One of the most damaging effects is learned helplessness. After repeated experiences where resistance fails or creates punishment, the brain begins to believe that escape is impossible. Even when opportunities appear, the person may feel too powerless to act. Recognizing coercion is the first step in breaking its influence. Certain warning signs appear again and again. Repeated pressure that ignores your refusal. Threats tied to your compliance. Feeling responsible for someone else's emotions. Gradual loss of independence in decisions, finances, or relationships. When these patterns appear, the situation is no longer simple influence. it has crossed into control. Protecting yourself from coercion requires reclaiming agency. Sometimes that begins with small acts, asserting boundaries in minor decisions, refusing to justify every choice, seeking perspectives from people outside the situation. External support can be crucial because coercion often thrives in isolation. Trusted friends, professionals, or support networks can provide clarity when manipulation clouds judgment. In situations where safety is at risk, planning a careful exit becomes essential. Escaping coercive environments often requires preparation, resources, and support. But perhaps the most powerful defense against coercion is internal strength. When someone knows their worth, understands their boundaries, and recognizes manipulation for what it is, pressure loses much of its power. Coercion ultimately reveals something about the person using it. They cannot secure cooperation through trust, respect, or mutual benefit, so they rely on fear, pressure, and control instead. Persuasion invites, coercion demands. And the moment someone tries to turn your no into a negotiation under pressure, you are no longer dealing with influence. You are dealing with control, and control always has a cost.